Open source is an incredibly social art.
Open source is innovation.
Like open source is enabling.
Open source is community.
And open source is weird.
Open source is incredibly important.
Open source is hard.
Open source is engaging.
Open source is collaboration.
Open source is like running the show.
Open source is ubiquitous.
Open source is, well, my life.
And open source is not free.
Hello, my name is Ildiko.
And I'm Phil.
And this is the My Open Source Experience podcast, where Phil and I will talk to open source veterans, newbies, their managers, and just really anybody who is either already involved in the open source ecosystem or would like to. This podcast will be all about the individuals, their voices, and their experiences that they've been through ever since they started to think about open source or getting involved in open source.
Yes, we'll show the various different types of open source communities that are out there, some pluses and minuses, and how to navigate them.
Before we dive in, let me give you some important reminders. People on the podcast participate as individuals. They do not represent any company or organization. All the thoughts and opinions are theirs. People share their stories and experiences, the way how they went through them and how they remember them, and reflect how those experiences affected their lives, influenced their decisions, and just changed maybe their careers or lives back then or ever since. Welcome to a new episode of the My Open Source Experience podcast. In this one, Phil and I are chatting with Rob Hirschfeld, and we are covering topics such as contributing to large open source communities and how it feels like when you are the user and not the developer in the group, the challenges of building architecture and community at the same time, and also the importance and art of saying no. Enjoy the show. Rob, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, history in tech, in open source, as much as you want people to know about you?
I'd be happy to. My name is Rob Hirschfeld. I'm CEO and co-founder of RackN, which is a company that has its roots all the way back in some early OpenStack adjacent technology. So I know we're going to dive into that, and we'll talk about that. My career in IT and infrastructure goes back, 25 years now, where I was the co-founder of a early cloud startup doing virtualization in cloud back in the VMware ESX beta days before they released the product, and have been working steadily in that part of the the ecosystem for a long time since. DevOps, infrastructure as code, automation. I took a stint. I served, it was, I think, 5 years on the OpenStack board, and led some really important initiatives for the OpenStack Foundation back when it was the OpenStack Foundation. I think I was one of the advocates actually for the Open Infra name change, coming back into it in the early days when some of the edge, the Open Infra groups were doing the edge work too. So I've been really deeply involved in the infrastructure side of open source for quite some time. I have some interesting stories, and I know we'll be talking through some of that specific history. I do. There was one time when the first time I remember anything about open source at all, though. This was in my first startup, and we were at a software convention in San Diego, at the Corona. I think it's the Corona, that classic hotel out on the island. Mm-hmm. And there was a software vendor convention, and these crazy startup people showed up, all wearing red hats, red fedoras. They had just gotten some money, and they were talking about this thing called Linux that nobody understood, but they were so excited about what they were doing. and the red hats were very distinctive. The red fedoras were very distinctive. And so it's funny going back. I always, they made such an impression at that show just by their energy, what they were talking about, and the red hat. That I still have this very crystallized mind, even though it took me another 7 or 8 years to figure out what they were actually selling at that show. But it's one of those things where you really sometimes the energy and enthusiasm for how open source is one of the things that's very distinctive in how these communities get formed and how people work together. But that's my earliest open source memory, if you will.
Was that like late 90s? When was
It
that?
was
Mid-90s?
No, it was 2000.
Okay.
I think it was in between. It was pre September 11th in that time frame.
And in that next, you said 7 or 8 years to figure it out. Like, did you have any further interactions with open source? And do you remember what led from that first memory towards figuring it out and then actually thinking that, oh, maybe this is something that I actually want to do something with or get involved in?
It's it's a great question because the chain is funny. At the time, things were proprietary. It was Unix, not Linux. It wasn't clear, that Linux would be popular or work at all. And we were doing Windows development work. And one of the things that was interesting, but I wasn't that involved in, was Java, which had sort of some of the early open source community formation around what those pieces are. And then, we would use open source tools and products. A lot of it was more shareware. Nobody was worried about the source code and sharing source code at the time. It was much more of a SourceForge. You go download stuff from, shareware pieces. You didn't really think about how things were built and what the collaboration meant for that. And I think that's what most people's experience has been, at least until, maybe a decade ago, was, just taking things off the internet and using them. They didn't worry too much about anything collaborative. I got interested in the collaborative aspect out of my experience at Dell, the pre-OpenStack formation. The team I was on at Dell was charged with bringing cloud and data products to market. And we brought 10 different products to market in a year. It was a crazy year. And what would happen is when we would do that, it almost always triggered our partner to get bought, sell, change, right? We had a lot of trouble with, our involvement literally made it harder for us to collaborate with those partners. And so either they would go off market because we were involved with them, or they would pat us on the head and say, you people at Dell don't understand anything about software. Just sell some servers and we'll fix it. And we were a software team. And at some point you recognize it doesn't matter what your expertise is, you walk in with the people you walk in with. But what happened is with these 10 solutions is we would try to help operationalize the technology, and the vendors would not want to listen to us because they didn't think we had anything to offer there. Or the technology would get sold out from under us. And we had sort of these dual problems of not being able to have influence and not being able to have longevity. And when OpenStack showed up, it created a unique opportunity for us because it was actually a community where we could contribute code back, where our expertise in doing something we could actually have longevity in how things were going. We didn't have to worry about somebody taking the tech away from us. We didn't have to worry about somebody saying, "Oh, you can't see that part of the software or change that part of the software." And it was, just completely game changing for us. We were able to jump in and participate and be part of the community because the community was defined by collaboration as opposed to a vendor relationship. And that was my first open source experience, and it was really really a significant difference in the whole interaction.
And when did that start, Rob? What year were you first engaged with OpenStack?
That was 2008. I'm what people would consider OG OpenStack. So I was at what was the Austin meeting where Rackspace was talking about the concept and bringing up the original designs. We'd been going down to Rackspace and meeting with the teams about what they were trying to do. So it was really those very first meetings, 2008, 2009, where we were forming what was going to happen. And the nice thing is we built some tech for installing and operating and provisioning, combined with work we'd been doing with Puppet and Chef that was really, we had the right tech to help start doing install work for OpenStack. So we had a lot to offer the team that was forming on how to make that happen.
So you were kind of part of forming the OpenStack community, right?
Very much. Yeah, it was a very small number of partners. Actually, a lot of the partners who we expected to be important players in the OpenStack days did not stay the course. Citrix was in there. I think it was Deloitte. There was a consulting company that was expecting to have a big impact. And Rackspace, which was really the foundation of it, really took a very open collaborative perspective. So they sort of, which is different than what you see a lot of times nowadays. There wasn't a lot of code existing already. There was some, but not that much. And Rackspace really was trying to build a coalition of partners to do joint development. I'm not sure I would repeat that experience. It's a very difficult way to start a project. And there were things that happened as a consequence of that initial design decision that are still incredibly deeply embedded in how OpenStack operates. Right, this idea that it was going to have multiple hypervisors embedded in it was a logical but horrible decision at the same time. Because it meant a level of complexity in the initial project to bring Zen in and Microsoft with Hyper-V in and just maybe to bring in VMware that really didn't make the project any more functional. It made the collaboration, the efforts more functional. And there's a lot of examples of things like that. The decision to be 100% in Python was a very architecturally specific decision, and the decision to divide the project into sub-projects and have such an API-driven, independent approach. Those are all designed because of this idea of, you have a lot of different parties who are going to collaborate together. And I'm not sure, it works for what OpenStack needed to be. If you're just designing a software project, it's actually, some of those things are actually really suboptimal design strategies.
Can add some complexity, that's for sure.
The idea that you're going to take core components of what you're building, networking, storage, identity and authentication, compute management, right, and split them into teams with different leaders, and then have them all coupled through an API. You immediately start with the core parts of the inner workings of the system actually now having competing priorities and they're decoupled in a way, but from a product perspective, those are actually tightly coupled concerns, and so it makes the architecture more challenging. Right? One of the things that was always an interesting there's a lot of things that in my OpenStack experience that I thought were amazing at the time, and I look back on and I'm like, what were we thinking? One of them is every OpenStack presentation that I saw and I would give starts with this landscape picture with all these code names in it, yeah. Right? And we would be like, oh, look at all this, and it's inside baseball. It's cool. Most of the people in that room didn't want to have to learn a project code name. to talk about anything. They just sort of like, I need you to run my VMs for me, please. Right. And they're like, well, that's Nova. And you really have a problem with Quantum, and you should go see that team. And it makes sense from an OpenStack and open source and collaboration team. But if you're a user, that's really exhausting. I have another story. This is from the Cactus Summit of things that have changed in my perspective over time. Cactus Summit was, I think, 300, 400 people. It was a pretty exciting, big in Santa Clara's convention center. And somebody, I think it was from Disney, stood up in the corner and said, hey, all this is really cool, but I need some help trying to make whatever work. And somebody else stood up across the room and was like, this is open source. If you have a problem with it, you need to fix it. And I was sitting in the back, I'm like, wow, that's super powerful. This user's empowered to go fix and whatever. And from an OpenStack, open source perspective, it's exactly the right answer. From a user perspective, now that I, seeing myself as that poor person who came here. Now they came to an open source conference, they should know, but they're sitting, I need help fixing your software and making it work. And you're basically telling that person it's not my problem. You figure it out. Mm-hmm. There's a balance in any of these projects to figuring out how to solve somebody's problem so they'll use your project, and creating a community where people are incented to participate and help and do what they can. And I think that's just an ongoing dilemma, right? There's a mix. A lot of times you'd say, oh, the vendors, they should have, there should have been 3 vendors standing around that user trying to help them at the end of the day. And that might be the right answer. But a lot of open source communities get very wary of that sort of, immediate commercialization, and it's not that welcoming to a new user either. And I don't know, I don't have simple answers for this. These are just, these are sort of those stories of what it looks like as you're building a culture for how a project should operate, and learning that what you see when you're inside the culture is awesome might look like outside the culture as very problematic or unfriendly.
I think that's one of the really confusing things about open source even today, right? In that, what is the relationship of an end user that is non-technical in an open source project? I mean, I was taught in the beginning that, open source is developed by developers for developers, right? And if you want documentation, go read the code, because that's the only real way you're going to find documentation, right? And and with that mindset, that too has a purpose, right? And that use is not bad, but as you say, I mean, well, as far as that goes, in the Cactus days of OpenStack, developers couldn't figure out how to run OpenStack.
No, they couldn't. No,
it was a challenge back in the day just for developers, and it was part of that complexity of the various modules that were helping that along.
And just to add to the timeline, the Cactus days were in 2012. So I think, or 2011, 2012, something along those lines. I think it was kind of.
I actually think even earlier, 2010.
2010.
No,
yeah.
And I think 2010 was the launch. 2010 was.
And then maybe settle on 2011.
2011 sounds right. I'd have to get my old Cactus t-shirts.
Oh yeah, that would be fun. We have a lot of cool t-shirts from that community.
Collection. Yep.
And it just I mean, it's interesting how we are talking about that developer user relationship, and I can still see almost the exact same conversations happening in communities. So I have a lot of questions to all the stories that you talked about. One immediate one to just this user developer relationship, as you had this experience, and then also eventually you had the realization that maybe this is not exactly the way to go. Did you have any opportunity to change this kind of relationships. I don't know if you were a user after that in another project and community where you could use that experience to change the interaction, or again, maybe
I actually
maybe
tried. No, I mean, I tried when Kubernetes was forming, and I was an early Kubernetes user. I because of the pattern, I actually started a cluster. We called it cluster ops, SIG cluster ops, and so early on in that community, I stepped in and was running the special interest groups for operators so that we could have these conversations and try and do that. And what we did inside of OpenStack, we still kept trying to do inside of Kubernetes. It turns out to be really hard. Is in OpenStack, we built a project called Crowbar. It was designed to install OpenStack as part of this sort of challenge, right? It's how you help people get moving, not from a developer perspective, but from a user perspective. And OpenStack had a lot of moving parts, and we automated all of those pieces. Incredibly powerful experience from that perspective. And so, that's been almost, just an ongoing story for me over the last 15 years now, on trying to sort of improve that out of the box operational experience and the day two operational experience for users using the software. And I've really put a lot of time in there. The interesting thing is it's very hard to make successful. Like the Kubernetes cluster ops work that I did turned into some great conversations with people who were using Kubernetes in general, but we had a lot of trouble finding repeatable operations patterns that people would keep using. And then that group sort of split into, there's this cluster admin tool that they built to try and sort of standardize that stuff. And that ultimately became their cluster API work, which is trying to sort of standardize, but it's been, I guess almost a decade of work there, and they're barely at a point where they have a standard operating practice for how these systems go. The challenge with the difference between writing software and using software, especially we're talking about infrastructure software, is the permutations of running software is very difficult and very personal, and versus writing software, you're sort of building the software, you can control it, it's a known input, known output. When you start talking about operating it, somebody's choice of, Dell versus HP versus Lenovo, or the operating system they're using, or the number of drives, or their network topology, those are all logical choices, but there's no standard, and the whole system falls apart. And what was hard in an open source community is to sit down with an operator who's doing something. If you're an operator and they're an operator, for you to sit down in a room with them and help them solve a problem means you're like deep in the weeds of their ops issues. And what I found is that it's really not community behavior for people to sit down and do that for other people. And so a lot of the open source ecosystem work breaks down when you get into how I'm using something. That ends up, a paid relationship, like a vendor relationship, ends up being a much more pragmatic. It's like, your friends can be your therapist, but they're not going to do the right job as paying a professional. And that sounds like a funny analogy, but in some ways, ops it can be like that. And it's the whole ecosystems don't work unless people invest time in helping solve each other's problems. Fundamentally, open source boils down to that. But if it's too expensive, if I spend all my time helping you solve your problems, or that's all I'm doing, a lot of open source people get burned out because they never do the stuff that they're supposed to do. They end up helping everybody else do their stuff. And that leads to burnout, and you can end up with a very short, or out of a job because you're spending all your time helping your competitors or other people get their stuff working, and you never do your own job.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to operations and and operators. So I attended a couple of like ops meetup, like operators are meeting, which is why it is called ops meetup, in various places, like maybe a few hours or 1 or 2 day sessions where operators are in one room. And my biggest takeaway is that I think that it's mostly a therapy session for operators, because being in operations is just one of the most thankless things that you could possibly do for a salary.
That's right.
And like that group therapy kind of still actually works. And sometimes you still get ideas in terms of what other people are doing, how they are working around something. There's still something coming out of those sessions that is digestible by developers, that someone from a vendor company could listen to, whether they're solving that in the open source community or somewhere in a bit more proprietary way. I don't have a say about that. I still kind of find it really valuable how you can extract information that otherwise would be hidden and would go through support tickets. And it's really not the same experience to complain through support tickets versus sitting in the room with people, with mostly operators, but a few developers as well. I think most cases we either had people who were both kind of and going towards DevOps and working a little bit on code and more on the ops side still, or we also did have a few contributors who were developers and they were not participating in operations in their companies, or if they were an individual contributor then in that setting. So we still did have some connection, and the information going through, like people actually sharing the experience of what it feels like and what it takes to operate the software that the developers are working on. I think that just in itself is super valuable. Although I know that it's hard to show how it is valuable on like a great extent. Like this is how the community and the software as a whole got better. You can't always really say that. However,
you can't.
what's your experience?
There's stories that come to mind from what you're talking about. Because I was at an Ops Summit in New York, and years and years ago, and we were in a big conference room, and people were complaining, and they were like, they kept bringing up issues, and sort of the end of every issue was like, and MSMQ is broken. MSMQ is the message bus that hooks together all the OpenStack components. And like we got to like the 6th issue, and people like, MSMQ is a piece of junk, we should get rid of it. And well, I think it was a developer who sat back. He's like, I don't think it's MSMQ that's the problem. It's just the thing where the problem shows up. And all the ops goes, oh, okay. And so, right, and we see this like with the work we do all the time, sort of like we're a platform that connects all a bunch of stuff together, and we expose issues all the time. This is a problem with Crowbar too. And so you blame the tools, like your tool's broken. It's like, no, our tool's telling you that something else is broken, not the thing. And that was that. So there's an interesting argument here of what's going on with MSMQ. I think there was actually a result from that where they improved the logging so that it was easier to trace back messages that were failing in MSMQ to the source of what the break was. And so something good came out of that. There was another instance back, this is in the Boston conference, Diablo conference, when Vish created the DevStack tool. And so just to set the contrast, at that conference, Dell had flown in a rack of servers, a mini rack, and we were in the hall demonstrating fully autonomous OpenStack installs on a rack of servers. Took about an hour. No, it's less than that, 15 minutes to get a full rack up and running. And so I'm running around showing people, hey, look, we've made it super easy for you to install OpenStack with a click of a button. It's great. And Vish and I were Vish is one of the early core developers. And he gets in the elevator with me and he opens up his laptop and says, Rob, I got to show you this. I have this thing called DevStack, and it's a one machine install of OpenStack. and it was running in Vagrant, and he was like, and now developers can install OpenStack without any of the extra infrastructure. I'm like, you realize I just automated all that 5 machine bring up stuff. He says, I know it's way too much stuff. Just this, developers are going to love it. And I was like, Vish, developers are never going to hit the networking and cross machine issues that OpenStack is going to need to get right if you give them a single machine install of OpenStack. And he's like, yeah, but it's going to take too much time. I just need to have it all work on my laptop. And that was a seminal moment where I was, you were asking about times when I watched OpenStack sort of journey into one path. The advent of DevStack, which is very developer friendly, literally undermines the developer's ability to expose and find multi-machine operational issues. And there is no useful OpenStack that's not a multi-machine OpenStack. That's maybe too broad, but OpenStack is a multi-machine architecture system, and sometimes if you're not careful, you collapse out the thing that you actually need to be troubleshooting. I personally think that the reliance on DevStack actually set OpenStack back about 2 or 3 years in progress, because it meant that developers could move very quickly without hitting issues that would be easy to diagnose and find if they were front and center all the time. This is true of any project you build, but if you build something that hides what most of your users are going to be stumbling on, then you've made it much harder for you to connect to those users, right? You've separated those concerns in ways that don't necessarily help you. So,
but didn't things ultimately get shook out as they were doing the integration testing? I know that there were some pretty hefty clusters of machines that were doing OpenStack testing, and the whole concept of Zool, and the whole point of bringing all that up
until relative. I mean, Zool's most of Zool's lifetime, before I became less and inactive, was still doing DevStack installs. So Zool was doing tons, hundreds of integrations every day, thousands of integrations every day, but against DevStack as the integration point. I don't have any idea when we're actually building multi-server integration tests. And what you could argue is I don't need, my first pass should be as fast as it possibly can be, and that's great, and that's true. But there's issues that only surface when you've got a multi-machine test environment, and they're much harder to set up and validate. And there's a whole layer of building those environments and making them go.
I wanted to get back to your topic of burnout.
Yeah.
And spending a lot of time working with users that were having operational issues versus getting your own work done.
Yeah.
Did you see that as an issue in OpenStack across the board, or did you see other forms of burnout? And I'm wondering, I mean, maybe this can talk a little bit about what you do. But given the fact that operators need so much help, did any kind of a good consulting set of a cottage industry form up out of helping users get their operations going?
Oh my word. There was a lot of money made and a lot of investor capital burned, doing exactly what you're describing. I'm trying to think of the order to answer this question, because I have some personal stories on it, and I think there's a really interesting question here about the OpenStack consulting. So there was, especially in the early OpenStack days, Mirantis was the most notable, but not the only. Did a lot of OpenStack setups and builds, and made a lot of money doing OpenStack consulting and builds. But one of the challenges is that there wasn't a lot of repeatable process around how to do that. So like when we were doing Crowbar, we were really focused on trying to make these repeatable process builds, but it was hard to move fast enough to be because there were people who wanted to build some really big infrastructures really, really fast. And so a lot of bespoke OpenStack installs got built that nobody knew how to upgrade or patch. And this is two sides. One is OpenStack wasn't particularly worried about automating upgrade and patch. And the consultants weren't particularly worried about automating upgrade and patch. And so we built a lot of OpenStack installs that were not repeatable and not upgradable. And you couldn't learn. This is like one of the things that drives our mission at RackN forward is this idea that we actually want to have automation that's reused and repeatable. And if I fix a bug in the automation, I want to go back and help you. Or Crowbar but this is what we wanted Crowbar to do, but we couldn't get Crowbar to do it, which was if we fixed Crowbar, then you could patch Crowbar, and then you get the improvements on the automation on the other side. There's an interesting story from Crowbar's early history, because Dell had been doing Crowbar sort of as a single vendor project, and SUSE got very interested in it and wanted to collaborate with us. And Crowbar, actually, they maintained Crowbar long after Dell stopped, and it was their OpenStack installer for a long time. And when we were doing that collaboration with them, they would do development work against Crowbar during the day in Europe, and they would test it against SUSE, because that's who they were, get things working, commit their patches, and then leave for the night. And we would show up in the morning and bring in their patches, and it would break all of our CentOS, Red Hat, and Ubuntu installs, because they didn't test on any of that stuff. Right. And that for us was that, that was a good example to me of this investment to make the partnership work. We had an engineer who would do nothing but check their builds, fix whatever they broke for the other operating systems, and keep that process going. And it caused, a lot of burnout and stress for us, because we had developers who couldn't move forward because they had committed a change, and we didn't want to revert the change. So that investment, and we had a lot of conversations with our leadership of, is SUSE worth it if they are slowing down our commitments and the things that we had to get done in building that project. And this is the classic example. There was benefit to them being in the project and collaborating with us, but our internal teams and our customer sales and what we were doing and what our promises were being slowed down because we couldn't move as quickly because we were cleaning up stuff that they had to do. So that type of thing is very, very stressful. We had people who just were like, I don't want to work on the project anymore because we keep getting behind from that. There was another interesting case that where I felt personally burned. I'd personally committed certain features to Rackspace as part of that cycle, so that they could meet some deliverables. And our business people we adapted Crowbar to work in Hadoop also, which nobody in OpenStack cared about, but was important to Dell. And we got to a point where, from our products perspective, where we had to finish the Hadoop features, and the Rackspace people who were waiting on me to do something, I had to go back and tell them we're not going to get it done. And those are, realistic pros and cons for doing this type of thing. I think I actually told them that they could do it themselves if they wanted to, but if they had, I'd still have to go and put engineers on testing, validating, making sure it didn't break our stuff. So it's really hard for that. But I do see, just open source in general, you watch, projects that get a whole bunch of traction, or especially single person projects that get a whole bunch of traction. And then, the person who's doing that ends up having to chase fixing, supporting everybody else's needs to get that type of adoption. And if it doesn't serve, if they don't have a benefit to doing that, they either run out of money doing it or they get exhausted. Yeah, and or get pulled off, right? It's, that's what, the cases I'm giving here is where I had leadership pulling resources off projects because they were spending all their time servicing somebody else's priorities. We tried to address that in the OpenStack. We had a product management working group where we were trying to coordinate activities across everybody else and bring in some more coordination on that. We had a lot of trouble getting that running. And I think some of that is how OpenStack leadership was structured, being very developer-led and developer-focused. There's, some of the commercial, getting commercial interests to have more say. There's a lot of cultural challenges in resource balancing for that. And I think that people assume that open source resource management is free. They make two mistakes. One is they assume developer resources are free when they're actually much more expensive. People don't think about it this way, but they're very expensive in open source projects. And I think they believe that they can be directed more easily. And those are myths. It's in some ways it's magical when it happens because people aren't doing it very intentionally. But it makes it incredibly hard to steer the ship.
Yeah. I mean, that product management forum was a first of its kind. I don't know any other project that actually had such a concept, and it was interesting to watch. And at the time as well, I mean, OpenStack was, as far as I'm aware, the busiest and most, it was just the most active project with the most organizations trying to get so much done at the same time. So that kind of balance of doing what you need to for yourself versus what you need to do for the project to move things along, that was hard for a lot of the leadership of the OpenStack project. I could sit back and watch that struggle that they had.
It's a really interesting challenge in how it went. I agree with you. I've met and I talk to OpenStack people all the time. What we created in the community, and still is there, was unique in the way the community operated and people's shared interest in how things were going. It's not present in communities the same way that I've seen. There's a lot of great people in the Kubernetes community, but they don't feel like a cohesive community in the same way that OpenStack felt. At the same time, we created a lot of bizarre fiefdoms out of the project structures, and a lot of gamification in how those projects were working. That ultimately made it slowed things down. It created a lot of polarization. That sort of started that tide turned, if you will. But yeah, I would remember having trying to influence a project lead to pick up a feature set or something like that. Or oh boy, I distinctly remember who was it? I was on a bus in Paris, hearing about how great Keystone was, the auth service, and all these cool features they've added. It was amazing. And it was. They did this great stuff because they had this vision that Keystone would be a standalone project for doing auth. I mean, even as a board member at the time, I'm like, but there's other projects that are dependent on Keystone to deliver these features to move those projects forward. He's like, I know, but I've got the potential to be a standalone auth project, and that's a weird tension within the project, right? Are you servicing your project and what could happen in this, or are you servicing the needs of how the integrated whole would work? And you're right, we were really unique with the product management forum, but at the end of the day, we didn't have any clout to help Keystone, or all these projects have similar things, make sort of a your priority list actually needs to be in service of the group. And all the people were well intentioned and they listened and they tried to do those things, but it only takes 2 or 3 developers in a project to show up and be like, I really want to work on these, an open source project, I really want to work on these features, to pull a project momentum somewhere else. flood the queue with patch requests for feature development that is not maybe the direction that you thought you were going.
Yeah. Back to like what you said. I mean, having fiefdoms, but having a lot of interdependencies between the modules. Right.
It was a very hard design, and we when we started it, there was a thought that it would let two pizza team type of thing and let people run, and like one of the things that happened with Keystone is that Rackspace was like, we got this, we're going to fund Keystone, and they sent it off to some outsourced developers that they had working on the thing who didn't like the design and just basically threw a whole bunch of stuff out. And like, I think tried to write it in Java or I don't know, it was crazy. And it took, I think 2 release cycles to get that sort of straightened out. And that was, we used to argue about benevolent dictators or not, and that type of thing. And there are times there is no benevolent dictator in OpenStack. There's times when that type of singular authority can force you to say, I'm not, if you keep working in this area, we're not going to take these pulls, and shut down work for that. A consensus is very hard to do. Very, very hard to do.
Yeah, particularly given the size. Yeah.
And separating into little projects is one way to make consensus work, because you've got you don't have to have as big an argument. You can have the controls. But it doesn't drive, consensus doesn't necessarily drive things together. And that's like one of the, just a little news of the day comment, right? Some of the thing that's interesting with the HashiCorp fork, right? Open Terraform now has a ton of multiple people chasing what it should be. That might be great. It might drive that project faster, because HashiCorp was not, moving it as quickly as it might move now. But at the same time, HashiCorp had a vision and a direction. They made this, they controlled that. And it'll be interesting to see that, we're about to witness that balance of a lot of enthusiasm and developers and ideas coming into a project. And it's not as clear yet if how they're going to say no. One of my lessons at Dell, I don't want to tell too many stories, but one of my lessons when I was at Dell, everybody thinks of these big organizations as like behemoths who can't do anything and they're slow and all this bureaucracy. And what I found at Dell was that the thing that they had to be really good at, that's hard, is they have to say no to stuff. They were brilliant people with great ideas, tons of opportunities, easy paths to market. But, they could only do so much stuff effectively. And so the thing they really had to do is be much better at saying no than average. And that's not a discipline that, people are used to having. We have a tendency to want to say yes in open source projects. Oh, yes, you're bringing your talents, do what you want to do. And in a lot of cases, no is actually the most effective answer for everybody involved.
Well, it's a balance, right? I mean, that's exactly it. That's one of the interesting things for me in open source communities that work well is, I've always found the belief that as long as you're not doing something detrimental to some other portion of the community, even if nobody else wants what it is you're building, go ahead and do it. And there may very well be network effects that end up playing off nicely.
The challenge is that there also might be code that breaks other things and isn't documented, and is somebody's dragging things forward that's not doesn't have a long-term maintenance strategy in it. So I agree with you, and I guess as I've come along, I see open source projects with a ton. There's two things. One is they have a ton of partially finished things. I mean, products do too. Don't get me wrong. But that there's a lot of that. And then the question I've been asking a lot recently is just how much can open source fix architectural issues and change architecture? Because it's very difficult for an open source project to reconsider its architectural work inside of its own framework. Those end up being either forks or rewrites, and they're.
And it depends, right? I mean, that is a cultural aspect, I would say, of an open source project. I'm going to go back to Linux as one that's been refactored more times than you can shake a stick at. Right? Because Linus feels that way, right? I mean, he'll say, well, okay, this release, we're not doing anything except totally refactoring the networking subsystem because you guys and your wireless drivers are ticking me off because nothing works.
Well, and you get something like Systemd, which people have a lot of feelings about, but converged systems management across the board in a really important way. And that was an incredibly divisive change that took actually a lot of political capital to get through the system. And I still hear people whining about it. You're right. And it was interesting because I talked to our CTO about Systemd, and he's like, I absolutely hate it. And it's the best thing that ever happened to Linux. Because he's like, now I don't have to worry about which distro I'm using to figure out how to configure stuff and start services, which had been a nightmare, absolute nightmare. So, and that's for me, that's actually, I often will look back to the Linux community because the ability to take technical excellence and drive to specific decisions. I mean, Linus talks about, we got a lot of lieutenants. It'll be fine when I retire if I'm hit by a bus, right? He gets the hit by the bus question all the time. I'm not so sure. I mean, I give that community, I give him a lot of credit for the culture because he got to build that for 10 years right before corporate interest. OpenStack didn't have that opportunity. No. There were a lot of deadlines that folks were trying to meet, not the least of which I was at HP at the time. I don't know if you know my history, but I was at HP when you were at Dell. Okay. In doing that work. And we were trying to get something stood up, right? We were back in those early days, we were trying to get public cloud stood up quickly. So deadlines were the matter. Oh yeah.
And that was, again, a different culture, a different set. And that cultural change. I mean, that's what I find so very interesting about open source, because open source is a license type. It's not a collaborative development type, right? And so
there's no instructions on the collaboration.
Exactly. And we see a great spectrum, which is kind of the point behind this podcast for Ildiko and I, is to talk about what those differences are and cherry pick what are the best ones. Yeah. Right? What actually works. So, and OpenStack is a great example.
OpenStack's an amazing example. OpenStack's an amazing example.
It is. And on that point, like Rob, since you were part of kind of the formation of it, and you were at Dell at that time. Yeah. So I'm kind of wondering how the experience was for you in terms of, was Dell supportive of what was forming? Did they have an understanding what they are getting into? Was it like, okay, let's have the software team playing around a little bit, why not? And then we also build servers in the meantime, and that brings us revenue. How was it?
Oh my goodness. Completely.
Did I just step on something?
No. It was awesome, and completely foreign to Dell. The reason it worked is because Rackspace and the Rackspace leaders had a personal relationship with Michael, and Michael Dell wanted to sell a lot of servers to Rackspace at the time, and was selling a lot of servers to Rackspace. So there's a lot of reason to want. This was before Amazon was the clear leader, and so there was a lot of and just geographically, right? We were in Austin. Rackspace was in San Antonio. Geographic proximity made a total difference here. But one, basically, I think Lou, who's CEO of Rackspace at the time, called Michael and said, we're going to do this thing. We want you to help. Michael said, I have no idea what that means, but of course we'll help. And my team got sent in to figure this out, do what you need. And the fact that we had, Michael's blessing on making it happen opened doors that we would never have been able to open otherwise. And when we went to do Crowbar and we're like, we're going to do this open source, we were the first open source project Dell had ever done. They did a ton of Linux and Linux adjacency stuff, which is Dell actually deserves a lot of props for their Linux groups. they'd never initiated a project like this. And, we just sort of flew through a whole bunch of stuff, a bit of asking for permission after the fact, but we had, top level buy-in to make it happen. And then it started getting, very, very positive response, and it became easier to keep those practices going. The thing that I think was less clear, and I think makes it hard for other projects to follow, is there was a degree of lightning in a bottle because of Michael's interest, because of OpenStack's celebrity, because we had a small software team that really understood how to do software and wanted to make that happen. Those things lined up. And it became increasingly hard to go back and do that. I actually have a big cup in my office just around the corner we had a contest of OpenStack versus VMware sales, and the OpenStack was outselling the VMware efforts at the time. So we got awarded the cup, and then the whole thing got sort of dissolved, and I still have the cup, but we only had to win it 1 year to get the cup. But there was a lot of excitement over this sort of revolutionary model on how we were going to do it. And it's easy for Dell, because Phil, for HP too, Dell would make money selling servers. They didn't have to worry about software margin on this. And so it was a very aligned moment for Dell to be like, oh, we're going to sell servers. We're going to not have to worry about VMware, which is giving us all sorts of trouble. And then they bought them and things changed. But this is which is a lesson in just how fickle that sort of thing is, right? It was like, hey, this is great. And then a couple of years later, they own VMware, and they're like, this isn't so great. And so that was a turning. One of the things that actually made the whole thing change in our mind, another funny story, is that we started partnering really deeply with Red Hat on this. And we were having this, while we were getting the partnership going, we had like this upstairs, downstairs moment. My bosses were meeting with Red Hat bosses about getting the deal, and I was meeting with the Red Hat technical people about their OpenStack efforts. And the Red Hat people were like, oh, we're so glad to be working with you, Dell, because y'all have, understand the ops for OpenStack really well, and you can help us get the ops stuff. Red Hat at the time had been changing their install strategy every 6 months. Things like Stay Puff, if people ever remember what that crazy things were, they had it was literally flavor of the day. So they were like, we're so excited to be partnering with you. 2 floors up, my boss was telling the Red Hat people, we're so excited to be partnering with you. We don't know anything. Please just tell us whatever we need to do, and we'll do that. And so that was the debrief on that meeting was very weird. It was very weird. And that's in some ways says a lot, not much about OpenStack, but a lot about corporate partnerships. But
And the structure of big companies, I mean, even just what you said, that you had the top level buy-in in terms of joining this, whatever this thing will be, that became OpenStack. And then it also sounds like that you had a really lucky alignment in terms of having a little bit of playroom on the software side and having the team with a really good understanding, and it just everything magically lined up for this to be successful. Is that a fair thing for observation to say?
I think so, although I don't, there's a degree of luck in that, and you have to be prepared for luck, if you will. Mm-hmm. I think that there's a takeaway for me, which is at the end of the day, Dell's a hardware company, not a software company, not an ops company. And so what you have to realize is there's times when you're involved in an organization that's not going to revert to mean, go back to what its sort of base is. And you can be in those organizations and take advantage of a moment where it's willing to change or willing to do something different. One of the lessons to me in all this stuff is that, but organizations generally do revert to mean. So, Dell's a hardware company. It's going to keep doing things that make it a hardware company. It's very, very difficult for any company to not be true to its core mission. And so, and this is, I think, a lesson for anybody who wants to do open source inside of a company, or even open source inside of an open source company. You figure out what the mission of the company is, and if the work you're doing in open source aligns with that mission, then you're golden, and you'll make the investments and things will work out. If you're off mission in the work you're doing, and what we did with Crowbar was a lot of fun, but it was off mission. And so, I didn't appreciate at the time, you have borrowed time when you were living on borrowed time. And there's times when you can pull that over the edge and it'll be great. I think we pursued things that used up some of the time that we had while we were off mission that might have created longevity. It's just really hard to know at the time. But yeah, if you're not on mission in any project, but I think open source is actually even more fragile because it's not funded. And so until, if you're investing in an open source thing, you have a limited time to figure out the funding model for it, and if it's aligning to the mission around what you're doing. And if you can't figure those two things out or don't have a path to, then ultimately the investments you're making are going to fall apart.
Yeah,
to say it's brutal hard. That's maybe a harsh truth, but
no, I wanted to hear the harsh truth, and I think what you said about mission, that is true for both open source as well as the corporate environments, like inside big companies. Like, you have to have the experience to know what's going on in there, because otherwise it's impossible to see or even just imagine what is going down there in different departments and different parts of the company, what is actually bringing in revenue, what's the actual mission, how it is changing. I also think that some of the observations we are making, we're only able to make it because it's like 1, 5, 10, 15 years later. And now, now in retrospect, I understand it now, but there was no way at that time for anybody to really truly understand. And seeing that, bird's eye view, like you're in it or you're watching from the outside. You can't really do both, in my experience. Can you tell us something about yourself that's not tech related?
Lately, I started taking ballroom dancing lessons with my spouse and love
Excellent.
it. Absolutely love it. Highly recommended. Learning to lead and learning to follow. Gender-wise, I get to learn to lead, and it's hard. And learning to follow is hard. I have a lot of sympathy for my wife on my bad leadership. But that I've really enjoyed that as a new activity.
And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. I really hope that you enjoyed the show. This season is full of very interesting topics like open source in academia, mentorship programs, how you design and develop infrastructure in a project together with thousands of people, and a really interesting one, money in open source. Stay tuned, because the next episode is just around the corner.
That was my first experience.
Oh, I loved it. Y'all had me telling stories that I haven't even thought about. And
Thank you so much for having me here. It was a pleasure.
Like, I will have coffee with the two of you any day for the rest of my life. Like,